Though the truth may vary, this ship will carry our.
Thank you. So I'm Yves. I am going to chair this introductory panel. It's a great honor for me. It was only a few months ago that I very tentatively wrote Ecole saying I have kind of an idea around doing something around the very theme of the conference. And at the time it was a very embryonic thought, at least on my part, and they enthusiastically said, yes, why not, this would be great. And then a few weeks later, I guess we had sent him a little information, he said, oh, why don't we make this a major panel, which was wonderful. So I'm very, very happy and I'm honored and delighted. I won't harp or I won't criticize the weather anymore. I was family here a few years ago touring Iceland roughly at this time of the year. I can tell you, except for 1 or 2 days of rain, we had 12 days of sun, so it was pretty good. And today is a bit of an exception, but the good news is the best pictures are made close to sunset, so you can have a long evening making sunny pictures. We are in trouble. A few years ago, Insead hired a man named Ben Schachtman. Ben Schachtman lives in Santa Monica, California, in a beautiful beachside villa. And his life is made of essentially training mostly would-be Hollywood stars and secondarily would-be successful politicians into public speaking and basically communication. And Ben Schachtman had simple messages, which is summarized in a few rules. One of these rules, a very strong rule, he had a few like this, was ABL. ABL. Any idea about what ABL stands for? Perhaps, perhaps not. Let me tell you, always before lunch. And his very strong advice is never try to engage with an audience after lunch. Now, you may have had a light lunch, so I'm very grateful you're here. But we'll try to keep you involved very much. And after the speakers on the panel make a short statement each, then basically we'll turn into a more interactive discussion. So I think you should all participate in a sense. We should all be involved. This is quite a remarkable group of people. Now I say that with some pride, obviously, because I'm the one who brought it together, but it's also a remarkable group of people, I think, because what they can bring to the theme of the conference, otherwise they would not be here. So let me just give a very short introduction, then I will make a very short self-introductory statement and then turn to them. Mikko Kosonen, who sits closest to me, is a remarkable executive and leader. He worked for years at Nokia. He always had the great fondness of academics. I remember the first time I met Mikko, he kind of blew my mind because he said, we are casually discussing, we are together on something else, nothing related to management education or even anything intellectual. And he said, oh, I used to spend my weekends with Gunnar Hedlund. If some of you are old enough to remember Gunnar Hedlund, he was actually one of the founders of EURAM. And Gunnar Hedlund was one of the most stimulating minds. He was in Sweden, unfortunately. He disappeared early. So I said, my God, you know, here is someone who spent this weekend with Gunnar Hedlund. That's intriguing. And they were spending the weekends trying to reinvent management and perhaps reinvent the world. And Mikko has a very rich history of being in leadership position in Nokia, then in the Finnish National Innovation Investment Fund, but at the same time building and pursuing close relationships with academia, including recently is now the chairman of the board of Aalto University in Finland. And he has some very ambitious plans around how to make, in a sense, a university more relevant to society and to business and to practical issues. So Mikko will have some very interesting insights. Christophe Midler, who is the second speaker, essentially he's a professor at Ecole Polytechnique in France. He's a member of the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research in France, research staff. He leads a lab there, and he has some very interesting and innovative ideas about essentially how to bring together in an almost osmotic relationship corporate learning and education learning, and he runs a very innovative PhD. I will let him talk about what's so special and different. But I thought that was a pioneering effort. He has been doing this for quite some years, but it's still a pioneering effort in terms of bringing business and management on one side and academics and research on the other, essentially closer together in some kind of co-discovery process, co-learning processes. The third speaker, José Santos, is also, it's a very intriguing background. Early in life, he wanted to start, become an academic. Then, for various reasons, he veered away from academia for a while, became a corporate leader, the CEO of a company we probably have all heard of or seen or tasted products of, a company called Segafredo, which is one of the leading companies in coffee making and coffee shops and so on around the world, which essentially José built. And at age 45 or so, he decided to come back into academia, did a PhD in Portugal. He has been teaching since at Insead, at MIT, at the Judge Institute in Cambridge, at various other places. And he teaches very innovative ideas around the practice of general management. Some decades ago now, I guess, STMicroelectronics was a nearly bankrupt company, state-owned between Italy and France, with a turnover of roughly the equivalent of 200 million euros. STMicroelectronics today is somewhere around 10 billion euros in turnover. It's one of the most successful semiconductor companies in the world. It's a very, very different and difficult context, as you know, very rough competition in semiconductors. And in a sense, Andrea played a major role around building this success. But more than that, also, is someone who reflects a lot around management education and has some very insightful perspectives on how to collaborate between management and business. He has been involved on the board of the advisory committee or the advisory board of HEC, on the subcommittee selecting the new dean of HEC like 2 years ago. He's also in the supervisory board of Bocconi, Esade, and has been quite involved also with Swiss higher education policy a few years back. So he brings, again, perspectives from both the business world or the policy world, like Mikko also straddles both private and public management, and also academia. Now, I want to just make one comment. Preparing for this and some conversations with some of my panelists kind of led me to recall, and I'm not doing it to present nostalgia. Nostalgia is, in a sense, the opposite of learning and innovation. But perhaps just to say, in my own experience, I was very privileged, very, very privileged, when I look back at it, to be at the Harvard Business School in the mid-70s, at a time where there was really a high level of intellectual effervescence around a very simple but very difficult idea, which was, what is the work of general managers? That was triggered by 2 or 3 things. That was triggered, one, by the fact that in the US, as in Europe, more complex, multi-business companies, some conglomerates, some related diversified companies were coming into being. And they were introducing multiple layers of general managers. There were subunits and subsidiaries and regions and divisions and group and sectors and so on. And we were asking ourselves, well, what are all these intermediate levels doing and how do they connect with each other? And that led to not really a collective effort in a way. It was not a joint project, but a series of projects on the part of faculty and doctoral students like myself. I was a young doctoral student then, to try to figure out how did these companies really operate. And in some way we were really struggling with the question of, how do we understand these newly developing companies? Now, obviously, the model here, or the source of inspiration, was Alfred Chandler, who back in 1962 had published this very influential strategy and structure book, but there were a whole bunch of faculty members around and a whole bunch of us as PhD students. I'm trying to say what characterized this spurt, if you wish, or this sudden growth in understanding. Not to try to reproduce it, history does not reproduce itself and does not repeat itself, but to try to say, are there some ideas or some observations that may be of a more general value? I think the first thing is, there was a focal point. There was this focal point of how do we understand general management in complex companies. Some people in the 60s had mapped out, Richard Rumeltin's strategy, John Stopford in international business, and many others had mapped out the existence of these organizations and their formal structures. But no one really understood the way they worked. So there was really a common challenge, if you wish, That was point number one. Point number two is it was a world of competition and collaboration. You had faculty who were rivals, but at the same time worked together. There was an intensive kind of crucible, an intense crucible of conversation and discussions. And that was a very healthy kind of dynamic. The third thing which is important is there were really multiple perspectives. You had people coming from various disciplines. You had people who were economists and finance, kind of hard numerate, but you had also people at the other end of the spectrum, like Yves, who was a psychoanalyst and was one of the first to introduce basically psychodynamics into the programs and the research of business school. And in between, you had everything like strategy and OB and organization theory and so on, and business history, obviously, around Chandler and others. So it was multidisciplinary. It was multiple perspectives. It was people who could respect each other, people who could dialogue with each other, actually enjoyed dialoguing with each other, but were very deeply different. And there were a few, perhaps the last key point to note for me is, there were a few among the fellow doctoral students, a few people who came with managerial experience. C.K. Prahalat, for instance, who was one of that cohort, had been a manager in India with Carbide, Sumantra Ghoshal with Indian Oil, Chris Bartlett, another of our fellow students, had been a manager at Baxter. So you had people who had first-hand experience of actually these big, complex companies from the inside. And that led us all, in a sense, to a respect for managers, which unfortunately I see perhaps less among. There is a form of academic arrogance today, which is, which I've seen more in the US perhaps than in Europe, thanks God, which is, we have gotten PhD degrees, we are very, very smart, we know all kinds of research methods and so on, and managers are not really that good. True or not, I think that was not our starting point. And our starting point is these people are doing something very difficult, very complex, very hard to do. We need to help them figure out how to do it. Related to this, there was something which, again, I'm speaking about that time, where one of the early hurdles in the doctoral program was what was called the administrative point of view exam. So essentially, we were given a very complex management case, very complex, very difficult, very rich, a rich administrative situation. And the question was basically, what should Mr. So-and-so do about this situation? And we had a few hours to write a paper on it, and then we were grilled by a jury of 3 senior professors, and if we did not pass, we were essentially kicked out of the program. So that was also a strong incentive to make sure that everyone basically had an understanding of, or wanted to have an understanding of how big organizations evolved. So that's there and then, but I think these ideas of saying, is there a common problem or a common curiosity? Is there some kind of collaborative, competitive relationships among a group of people doing research in that area? Is there a sense of multidisciplinarity but tolerance at the same time, willingness to engage in dialogues across intellectual domains or into disciplinary boundaries? A mix of people who were in a sense pure academics, but also people who were actually, like José Santos did later, for instance, having first had a rich career in management and then saying, I want to become a real academic, not just someone who lectures about my own experience telling stories. And I think this was really very important. The world has obviously changed, but if we want to rekindle a sense of successful research in action, the sense of really researching managers in action, perhaps some of these experiences, or at least the lessons I'm trying to tease out from that, may still be relevant. But that's really what the 4 panelists will develop more. I've given them 7 minutes, they're probably going to take 8 or even 10, but that should leave us plenty of time also for a conversation later on, and there will be mics, or there are mics in the room and so on, so we can all participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves, for your opening remarks, and thank you very much for the invitation to Iceland and this very, very interesting panel. As Yves was brought up in his introductory remarks, I've been working all my professional life in the intersection between academia and practice, as well as in the intersection between, most recently, the last 10 years, between public sector and private sector. So I have some experiences of this boundary spanning, bridge building roles, which is not so natural and evident and for most people. And let me share with you now a couple of kind of practical examples from my career, and then with a couple of reflections then on what can we learn from the challenges of working in this boundary spanning role, which is so critically important to address the kind of wicked problems of the world, because they cannot be solved by any one party alone. You have to be bringing different disciplines together. So this boundary spanning role is critically important. Let me start by sharing with you my first kind of this boundary spanning experience that took place in the beginning of 1990s, when I was completing my PhD thesis at the Helsinki School of Economics, which is nowadays part of Aalto University, while working at the same time for Nokia. So I was an odd person to come back to university to finish my PhD after doing the master's in the school. And I was surprised by the harsh criticism that I got, not only because I was not part of the community, but mainly because my research agenda stemmed from my practical life experiences and not from the academic world. So I had seen a problem that Nokia was facing as a company. I wanted to understand it better, to do research on it, but it didn't fit into the research agendas of the business school. And so I had difficulties in getting my acts together and getting some support from the business school. Had I not then met with Gunnar Hedlund and Lars Gunnar Mattsson from Sweden, who were kind of they were renowned academic authorities that supported my work. They saw the value of this kind of research in action those days, and they supported my work. They saw that the world was changing. There was a paradigm shift in how companies internationalize, and I wanted to challenge the current theories then on born global theories, and they supported it, and it certainly was they saw the value also to the academic community of this work, but most of the academic community did not. So that's the problem. Of course, Nokia, then my company, benefited hugely from it, because those kind of the theories and the recommendations of the study then helped Nokia to internalize, in fact globalize quicker than any other company. So we were able to take the research findings directly to action. So what is the learning from this? What's the kind of if you reflect this a little bit, what's the kind of from this little story? I would say that research in action is critical when operating on the bleeding edge, like Nokia was those days. And nowadays, most companies are operating on the bleeding edge, so to say. When you're operating in the bleeding edge, you cannot afford waiting the academic community first to understand the phenomena in question, then do the research, and finally let consultants to translate the academic jargon, then to practical business recommendations. That linear thinking is kind of we don't have the time for that. All of these have to take place at the same time in order for business leaders to benefit from the academic world and for the academic world to be relevant. And I really see that in the future and even today, business leaders should increasingly see themselves as kind of theory creators, formulating hypotheses and testing these hypotheses constantly in real world. You could probably say that strategy equals to your own theory of competitive advantage, which have to be tested constantly on the market. And this is what leaders should more and more do, but they need help there. So, and this is where academics could step in, and if they have the wish and if the incentive structures of universities support this kind of thing. They do not today, unfortunately, and that's why we don't have enough of this kind of collaboration that would definitely be needed. Let me then jump into a second boundary spanning experience and some reflections on that as well. The second experience took place in 2005 and 2007 when I was working on a book with Yves here on companies' renewal. As the head of Nokia strategy those days, I saw the company becoming a victim of its own success, but I couldn't do in my capacity as the head of strategy very much about it. So I thought then that repeating what I had done in the early 90s would help to address a real-life phenomena, do some research on it, and then give recommendations and So we did with Yves, we did a very comprehensive inductive research study on 10 companies, came up with the findings, and which I'm still proud of the findings. But unfortunately, those findings and recommendations came too late. Nokia could not be saved anymore those days, what's then the learning of why didn't it work this time? It worked in the early 90s, but not anymore in 2008 time. I would say that one of the main reasons is that Nokia's management not getting the message as late as 2005 has to do something which I would call here an execution trap. After over like 15 years of success, you tend to fall in love with your business model and everything around it. Your strategy turns gradually to routines and you stop questioning it. You also create over time your own contextual language which fits perfectly your own that current business environment and model, but it does not necessarily capture the new phenomena that is around you. So Nokia, as we all know, was built around mobility and GSM. And when internet came and the landscape for Nokia changed, Nokia did not have the vocabulary and the mindset to grasp the new phenomena. It should have kind of raised the level of abstraction to one step higher to capture the elements, but the contextual language kept it was unable to adapt the opportunity. So Nokia had become a victim of its own too contextual language and execution mindset. It didn't have the tools and patience to sit down and think broadly and deeply enough. And in fact, it had also, over time, lost many of its original creative thinkers because they were not needed anymore when the execution model was on predominant. So people left those who were the ones who were challenging the status quo. And I must admit that also on a personal level this works. I found it very hard when I translated myself again from a leader to a researcher with Yves. I found it extremely difficult to kind of become a researcher again after so many years in the execution mode. As ex-head of Nokia strategy, I was used to conceptual work, but I found it very hard to be neutral and avoid jumping to too fast conclusions. Because rigorous inductive research requires a lot of pure observing and hearing and listening before moving to conceptualization and possibly the generalization. I always, by the way, remember Yves kindly asking me to stop talking and writing like Leonid Brezhnev, which is the ex-Soviet leader. In other words, kind of using nice conceptualizations which are not anymore rooted in reality. And that's what really, I mean, and it taught me a lot then.
Also hard to read.
Yeah, hard to read. So, it was a slow process and required time and space to kind of, and that's why my recommendation based on both of these kind of two boundary spanning experiences is that you have to have much deeper and more regular dialogue between academic and business world, and this does not happen by itself. Companies need to understand that distancing yourself from your daily routines takes time and requires the right space. And you don't necessarily have the time, but you have to take the time. Otherwise it doesn't work. And business schools, and this is my last point here, business schools should really ask themselves the existential question, why do they exist in the first place? Are they there? Are you there only to publish academic papers to other academics? Or are you there to help companies to grow in a sustainable way and build a better world? If the answer is the latter, then business schools should seriously question, for instance, their current incentive systems and what are you doing? What is the existential reason for existence? So I would like to stop here and start the discussion. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Yves, for your invitation to this panel to give me the possibility of sharing my experience on the subject. I'm doing management research in the early 80s in the domain of project organizing and innovation management, and constantly practicing what I call here interactive research methodology since this date at the Management Research Center at Ecole Polytechnique. Research practice of this kind has been denominated under various names: intervention research, clinical research, interactive research, action research. Defining this methodology and its variations had been the topic of many papers and books, among which many Europeans, such as Rolf Lundin, Michel Berry, Armand Schwell, Albert David, who is there, to prevent potential misunderstanding. I will just highlight two characteristics of such methodology. First, define the initial research question by an empirical questioning shared with practitioners. The traditional academic way is to begin with analyzing the conversation within a specific theoretical field, find the famous so-called research gap, and design research to fill it. In interactive research approach, you begin to share a puzzling empirical situation with an organization. For example, for me, in the automotive sector, in which I met many researchers in the mid-80s, how to organize projects to develop the new product design capabilities. That was the topic of the empirical field. Second, organize during the research journey regular interaction with professionals to get feedback on research outputs and collectively debate about the orientation of the research journey. My contribution in this panel will focus on two issues. First, why, from a management academics point of view, adopting such a research methodology. Second, what are the conditions associated to the implementation of interactive methodology. I will exemplify my input on this question with research on project and innovation management transition in auto industry, which are typical of such methodology implemented with a French firm, Renault, in this period. So, why adopting this research type of methodology? From my academic point of view, the answer would be to understand the learning processes behind managerial transition. This methodology provides an access to the way reflective practitioners collectively formulate questions about transitions, explore and experiment new scenarios, consolidate or not new theory in use to implement the transition. I insist on this point of organizational question formulation. Modern organizations are reflexive and dynamic. And an important capability for this reflexiveness and flexibility is how they open and formulate collective questioning when confronted to novel and puzzling situations. If you share this interest on this question, a relevant methodology is not to ask practitioners what they answer to your scholar question, but to understand why and how they open this empirical question. And after that, to go on and organize an interactive journey to study this question with them. Taking the example of Renault accessible car strategy, or low-cost car strategy, the questioning was opened by the former CEO of Renault, Louis Schweitzer, in the late 90s. He was in complete skepticism with the high executives of the firm who had the classical vision that only high-end is profitable. The novel question was, as the emerging markets are nowadays the growing ones for automotive sector, is there a profit opportunity in serving these markets with new and specifically designed products and not the traditional way, which was recycling products that have been primarily designed for mature markets. Interacting with the teams that explore and answer this question helped to understand how the firm collectively developed a strategy and capabilities to implement a relevant answer. I would just point out 3 points there. First, a structural characteristic of Renault organization with empowered heavyweight project managers that had been experienced in the early 90s, and an ambidextrous governance by the CEO of the firm. Second, a conjunctural window of opportunity to settle a disruptive learning process under the radar of the main headquarters executives, because at this period the firm was focused on the Renault-Nissan alliance, and so what happened in Romania was no interest for everybody. So they could make some transgression of the usual design habits. Third, the fact that with this project, under the radar, they build up capabilities and strategic capability and also design capability to develop such a low-end line of business. So this result was interesting to help to understand a strategic enigma. The enigma was that when the success of this strategy was well known in the automotive sector, it was not copied by the competitors, whereas strategic mimetism is particularly strong in this sector. And it's still the case 20 years after. And to understand that the competitors couldn't copy that is, you have to go deeper in analyzing the transition, that it cannot be copy-paste as you understand. Now, going to the condition to implement such methodology, I only 2 minutes, so I will, 1 hour, so I will be very brief. 5 conditions, and I stop there. First, accept some kind of an adventurous, open-ended research strategy. The empirical learning journey will probably drive you on fields and questioning different from your ex-ante research hypothesis. This is perhaps very easy for all researchers as I. It is less easy for a young researcher who has to be socialized rapidly in the academic community. So I strongly affirm that we have to support such kind of adventurous management research type. Second, the fact that, of course, such a methodology is very time-consuming. And so you have to access to what I call emblematic cases of interesting transition. Every case it takes time, so it has to be worth it. Third, the fact that you have to open the black box of the firm and persuade it that it's a useful risk to have this dialogue with researchers, and that you have to be legitimate on that. And this condition, I think, refers not only to the person that does the research, but more on institutions that can organize this legitimacy of action research. Fourth, the fact that when this research journey is going on, you have to organize a dual supervising process to keep the researchers socialized and driven by research community on scientific criteria. The major risk of interactive research is evidently to turn into a consulting practice that is no more aimed at producing interesting general theory, but only a profitable result for the firm and the consultant. And so this called for specific rules within the community, local community, the laboratory, the center, to organize this kind of double bind between relevance and rigor. Last but not least, the type of vehicle that helps the conversation with practitioners. Academics love 3-star journals, but professionals don't read them. They read more books, and books also has are more useful to explain the complex and pluridisciplinary fact that happens within an important transition of a firm. So I personally favor both media, both as a reader and an author. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe?
And thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with you, and share some thoughts about two passions of mine. I am José, but I am not related with José Mourinho, as some of you may know. José is a very common name in my country. I do not teach or research soccer. I appreciate soccer. By the way, we just won a few minutes ago, just for information purposes. And I have never had Cristiano Ronaldo as a student of mine. Portugal is kind of bigger than people think. Anyway, so the two passions of mine I want to speak to you a little bit about, and I wrote some notes so that I could be short, are global management and general management. And that's what I mean when I will simply utter management. So first, I am an optimist about academic research and management practice, and at least I'm an optimist in two counts. My observation is that the average quality of management has increased dramatically over the last 40 years, the time in which I kind of understand management. Though surprisingly, the mean has increased, the variance has also increased. I have no explanation for that, it's just my observation, and I think it's an interesting thing to look at. And I am able to relate or explain a lot of the improvement with the growth of business administration students, with the growth of business schools, with the growth of academic research on management and disciplines that somehow relate to management. And so in a word I could celebrate research in action. On another count, when I was preparing for this panel, I did something I had never done before. I may actually turn it into perhaps a chapter of a book, not really a book. I listed all the academics that have or would have influenced me as a manager because of the knowledge that they created in what one could deem the frontier of management. So I stopped when the list was more than 50 academics long, with each of them having sometimes more than one contribution to me as a practitioner, potentially. And I noticed that these academics come from very different disciplines and use very different methodological approaches in their research. As an example, I flew to Reykjavik with two of them, Yves and Jay Barney, who, although share the similarity of strategy, come from very different traditions in research. And I want to recall the first two teachers that made a direct impact on me with their academic work when I was a student at London Business School in 1978. 19, and not 18, 1978. Theodore Weinschall and Ehrenberg. And you see the difference if you have the fortune of knowing them as I did. Weinschall was an art theorist, a qualitative guy using case-based research, and Ehrenberg was in marketing, a quantitative guy, and a logical empiricist at heart. So very different methods, very different disciplines, but they both contributed to me as a manager, as a general manager, to be, and I have no doubt that they and others made me an effective manager, or at least created in me the ability to quickly become one. And in that sense, I am deeply grateful to them and so many other academics that I was able to study. So why am I here? Not just to celebrate that, but also because I am sort of slightly worried. Management is missing in action in business schools. I wondered if you noticed that there is no management in business schools. There are no management departments. Very seldomly does someone identify herself or himself as a management scholar doing management research. Disciplines have one so far. So, management is not just absent, it has been often replaced here and there with what Pfeffer adequately calls leadership BS. I'm also here because I see less and less research about management, relative to the 80s, a period that Yves referred to, and more research on pieces, small pieces, of what may constitute management. And I see also that several academics, who Yves mentioned also in his introduction, were focused on understanding management, but were unable to turn their research into a replicable and scalable practice. And in that sense, they failed. So, management as an object of research is not the problem. So what is the problem? Well, method. Method is. And method is in two very different ways. So let me briefly share with you my two contributions to the panel. The first contribution is that we need to refute simplification and reductionism and embrace complexity as a method, not as a solution. So I follow Edgar Morin's complexity as a paradigm. So interestingly, Morin cites Machado's Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar, in his assertion that we learn how to learn by learning. So the method is not just the beginning of each of our journeys as researchers, but it's also the end of each journey. And a successful journey should always take us to a beginning that is different from where we started. So we must take it as our endeavor to develop a method proper to research management. So embracing Morin's paradigm of complexity means, for example, that we accept emergence in that we cannot understand and produce knowledge about the whole by producing knowledge about the parts. That we accept that the knowledge about a part must always be related with the knowledge about the whole to which it belongs. That we accept complex causality, i.e. mutual causality, feedback loops, and refute linear causation. And above all, I would argue in management research, that we accept and integrate the irreversibility of time. Time is, as it were, of the essence in management. So in management research that produces knowledge for action, we need to focus on the interactions more than we focus on the pieces that interact. Management is not a multidisciplinary field. It is a field in search of discipline. It will never be one if we do not improve our ability to learn about management, i.e. our method as management scholars, by learning about management, by doing research on management. My hope is that many of you will one day, after researching enough about management, be it about disciplinary pieces of it, may realize that your contribution may be not about how to manage better, but how to learn about management better. So not to create knowledge about management, but to create the methods we should use to create knowledge about management. My second contribution is that management itself is research in action. That management is about realizing new collective performances, at least new relative to the existing ones. And so we need to start by distinguishing the performance of the firm from the value of such performance. It is, of course, very useful to describe IKEA's unique business model or its remarkable culture, quote unquote, and to explain the value of its superior performance. But that is not management. Management is about the interactions over time that afforded IKEA the potential of such business model and culture, and how IKEA's general manager, Ingvar Kamprad, intervened over time so that IKEA discovered its performance. Kamprad was, as it were, a researcher in action. It is, of course, important to see how bad portfolio moves have damaged GE's value so much, by the way. I just say GE today because symbolically they were removed from the Dow Jones and replaced by Walgreens, as we speak. They were part of the original Dow Jones in the late 19th century. It's interesting that Walgreens is kind of a reflection of the global world we live in, and given this is EURAM, Walgreens is, of course, managed by a CEO that is Italian. That was a detail, and not because Andrea is here. So, of course, it is important to see how that portfolio moves damaged GE's value so much, but what matters is why and how a talented CEO and a group of talented top managers transform GE's performance with such dire consequences. So managers don't manage firms, they manage the performance of firms. Managers don't need to be told or taught what to do, but rather how they can find out what to do in the particular circumstances of place and time of their firm. They need to be taught method. So we will improve our research in action if we accept to promote on research about research in management, i.e. method, and that we accept that management is itself about research in action. Thank you. I just want to point out that the Latin was the first that kept time. Technicality.
Thank you, Joe. Andrea?
And you will be the last to keep timing.
You will have to be careful.
So, thanks, Yves, and thanks to everyone here. When Yves asked me to come to this panel, he said, Andrea, try to bring your point of view from your experience in the business schools. I've been in the past now since 2002 in the advisory board of some of the European leading business schools and as manager. And I'm trying to touch on the issue of where we stand in general management between the business schools and the companies. Up to sometimes in the 90s, 1990, let's say. The world was simple, was predictable. The future was just the projection of the past. So as Mikko was saying, for the scholars, the problem was to find a significant business case, study, abstract, and generalize. And for management was reasonably simple. It was the famous plan, organize, lead, and control. We had asset-centric companies, so with a big inertia. What happened new? New is that the future became less predictable until it became totally unpredictable. Two forces are driving. One is complexity, and complexity means having an ever-increasing number of variables, and it's difficult to identify, let alone study, map, analyze the interdependency between variables. And the other point is the required breadth of knowledge, because again, to understand the difference, the relation between variables, you need to understand a good number of them and master them. The other force is speed. Speed adds two critical dimensions. One is that by the time you reach conclusions, the world has changed, so you have to go back and redo your study, which is well known in the military. No? And the other point is very difficult to split endogenous and exogenous changes. I'll make one example. Today, semiconductors are doing great. And each of us is convinced he has done a fantastic job. Now, is it the market? Is it the dollar exchange for the Europeans that has changed? And all we did has not changed anything? We will see. But it's clear that when you are running and the world is changing, it's very difficult to understand if your actions really brought a result or if the result is coming from endogenous, from exogenous elements. So the key in this moment for the whole industry is two questions. How do you take decisions without knowing all the elements, and how to manage without knowing what happens next? The Nokia case was one, but others are on the way. What has been the reaction? Basically defensive. Academy, also driven by the incentives. The way to incentive, the incentives for new and young people is, for me, absolutely crazy. So it's to focus on single elements, find the right spot to emerge, to say something new, without having to develop a huge knowledge that requires 30 years, and to often making sense of huge available databases and try to make sense of what you can grasp out of these data without fitting the whole picture. Make an example. Somebody studying, this is old, but exchange rates or tariffs implication on supply chains or operations. It's clear it's one element, but changing my operations is related also to how the market changes. It's related also, if the mobile phone users are moving from Korea, the leading to China, the product will be different, and I need to understand that. And it's part of the same strategy that has to deal with the tariffs, has to deal with the exchange rates and everything else in the world. So we are getting into reductionism, as was said before, where the need is for a holistic approach. Management, on the other side, is facing problems without having general accepted management principles. We are back to the general management principles are 50 or 100 years old. So what is the reaction? Play it safe and limit risk. And this is very intelligent in a world where it's moving at the speed of light and where not taking risk is really the biggest risk you can run around because you stand still. And as José was saying, management quality has increased. The issue is that the world is moving at a double exponential. Somebody was saying, innovation is moving at a double exponential. Shall we be able to keep up with this speed increase, with the acceleration needed, or not? So what comes next? I think that academy and industry need each other badly. Management needs a new management theory to navigate a scenario that's getting more complex and fast-changing and more interdependent. Companies, and here we have three players, companies. Companies have always been, and are more and more, knowledge and the ability to bring knowledge to market. Assets today are often not needed. They are often outsourced. You have huge companies, Google, where are their assets? Yeah, they have all the server farms. It's correct. But people like Cisco never had any operations in their life. They outsourced everything. So the world is changing there. And knowledge and building dynamically contributions of people and processes, because in the end, knowledge is people, and bringing knowledge to market is processes. So you need a dynamic combination of people and process to reach objectives that continuously change. Because when you start a program 3, 5, 7 years ahead of the market, as often happens, think of 5G or whatever, you know that you are starting one direction, but where you arrive is going to be different from where you're planning before. This implies new governance, implies new processes, new organization, new management styles, new people, different people from the past, and different relations between power, which is rigid. A power organization is rigid in a world where we need agility. And again, I think it's not, somebody has said it 100 years ago that management is about power and shareholders is about returns. So, going to managers. Managers have also another big challenge. Strategy and executions were thought to be two separate processes. No more. That's over. they are a seamless, continuous, integrated process. And paraphrasing Kant, I think, strategy without execution is sterile, execution without strategy is blind. And you have to keep the two keep changing at the speed of the market today. So Yves, when we made a panel in 2006 at the Schumpeter Society, mentioned the word of the impresario, like the new management characteristics. Somebody who has to understand everything happening in a theater has to understand that he's better not go and replace the tenor because he's going to make a disaster. But on the other side, has to understand if the director is the good one, and if the prima donna are fighting among each other, who should he choose or how he can still run the business and also be able to go and sell tickets if somebody falls sick at the wrong minute. So we have really new characteristics of management. Academy. Academy needs to go back to address general management complexity. Other sciences have done it. Life sciences, physics. Think of CERN. CERN is doing cooperative research since 1954. You wouldn't have particle physics today without cooperative research. There is no way, if anybody has ever seen the equipments, building a synchrotron or building the new accelerators just by the mechanical guy or the electrical guy who does it, and someone else tells how it should be, and the physics comes next, you're dead. So the interrelation between the different parts of a business school and management, which is, I don't know, marketing, finance, strategy, organizational behavior, operations, is what general management needs. And you cannot solve a supply chain issue just by addressing one small issue in there. You need to address it in a holistic way, in how this in the implications in the whole company, and in the performance of the company, in marketing, and in the different sides of the world. And this is what we need. So I think my conclusion would be that the discipline of the future is studying interrelations between all the variables. And to do this, we need institutions. Some universities have done it in engineering. Some of them have created flagship programs. Think of the EPFL with Alinghi, the boat, or with the Picard plane that has to turn the world without any fuel. And then, of course, there is fundamental to 1 milliwatt is an issue. Because if you have 100 components with 1 milliwatt, you are unable to fly, or you fly for a limited amount. So with these programs, finding the way to bring together all the different disciplines and bring them together with management to solve the real issues we have in life. And the last point is that I was not surprised, but what's interesting, I was visiting a US military base this spring, and when you get there, a big one, they have these words with vision, teamwork, execution. And that's what also José was talking about. In the end, what we need is methodology to master and manage the future. The change we must do as management, as research, is moving from a powerboat, where you decide I go from here to there and I go straight, to a sailing boat, where the wind is changing and I have to change. And I have to be as fast as I can. But I need to change quickly, because otherwise I go nowhere and I just stop. This is the change we need to do. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to all the panelists. we'll open up for general discussion just in a couple of minutes. Before we do this, as I was listening to the four panelists, I was struck, and probably you were struck in the same way, by some echoes of themes and so on. And this was not pre-planned, you know, we did not spend a lot of time deciding who was going to say what. We informed each other. But let me just highlight a few. One is, which struck me, is this notion of the research as an interactive journey. And Christophe said that very clearly, but this idea that, you know, we should not have too rigid plans and designs in the research we want to understand management. The second interesting theme is this question of complexity, both in context, I mean, yes, speed and complexity and interdependence, but also more intriguingly, perhaps taking complexity as a research method. In other words, fighting against, or perhaps resisting, I should say, our natural tendency to go for simplification and making the problems modular. I have a number of colleagues, they always get on my nerves a little bit when they say, no, I don't want to research this because there are too many moving parts in there. And the idea that there are too many moving parts, then it cannot be researched. But then it also means that, indeed, we cannot reach management issues very usefully if we try to decompose the management problem too narrowly into small pieces. So I think that those are important themes. There is another one around, obviously, dynamic changes. The world has changed, the issues have changed. There was an interesting question around the appropriateness of language. And I think the appropriateness of language works both in two dimensions. It works laterally between academics and executives. It also works vertically between executives who are often too far down in their own context and their own jargon, if you wish, and academics who are too far up, in a sense also in their own context and their own jargon, and find that there is no, they talk past each other, there is no way to create a real dialogue. And then I love Joe's point about management has gone missing in action. That in other words, when we look at the curricula of our schools, perhaps we have diluted management into a series of sub-areas which to some extent align with departments and disciplines. But where the integration of saying what is really the work of management has a little bit been lost. And this, I think I was hearing recurring words around we need more integration, we need cross-border collaboration and so on. So these are just a few themes. We got another 40 minutes or so. So I would be happy to open for questions and discussions unless the panelists have some immediate urging comments on each other's presentations. So if you want a quick reaction to some of you heard from the others, we can spend a minute or two on this. Any Mikko?
Not necessarily a comment on my colleagues' kind of presentations because Yves summarized the common kind of qualities of our presentations, but I would like to kind of raise the bar and bring up one perspective stemming from my current experience in operating in the intersection between public and private sector, because I have the feeling currently that both leaders and managers in the private and public sector are still living, and why not also business academia, in this illusion of rationality and causal relationships and linearity, which was touched by all of us, and hence we need kind of this to understand complexity better and the methods to manage it, because and this is my point now. The challenges that we are facing, humankind, and are by nature very wicked. So the most difficult problems that nation states like Finland, Iceland, and you name it, are facing, and companies, they call for collective action, and not just cross-disciplinary within business school, cross-disciplinary between universities, but also tight collaboration between public and private sector and even citizens. So you have to build ecosystems and new solutions in an environment where all these players are in flux, they change, and you need also methodologies for this kind of environment. So this is just what I wanted to bring up, which did not come yet in the panel.
Thank you. Any other comment? No?
Just a sort of politically incorrect comment. We are here a senior age researcher, and I think we completely agree on the importance of complexity, taking the journey with practitioners and so on. But perhaps the problem is not for us, it's for young researchers, because they have socialized in a world where this kind of methodology is very hard in order to make the records, the track record that will allow you socialization in the community. And so I think our role is not only to speak about what it's great to do, but also to support the institutions or create institutions that help young to do that.
I cannot resist commenting that from, let's say, Aalto University point of view, and this is, I also ended my presentation on the question that if business schools want to have a real kind of the fundamental question is really, I mean, be able to do this kind of address general management issues and wicked problems. The incentive systems, the reward system of universities have to be rethought, and it's clear that, for instance, if I look at Aalto University, any other, I mean, the tenure track system and the criteria there are not directed to help us much here. I mean, on the contrary, they are taking us to the wrong direction. So I think it's a fundamental question that the academic community as a whole have to address.
But these are pretty. That's a pretty good point. We have to open up for.
Though the truth may vary, this ship will carry our bodies safe to shore.